Great, we're live. So we'll wait a moment or two for our online viewers to see the notifications so they can click to join us. But we already have a fantastic in-person audience here at the Siena Art Institute. So it's really wonderful to have you all for today's event with our guest speaker, Michael Brennan, who's not only our guest speaker tonight, but is also our artist in residence right now here at the Siena Art Institute. So it's really wonderful for him to be here as part of our community. And we certainly welcome your questions and comments. We'll save time at the end of the talk to respond to Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions or make comments. And also for people who are joining us, for our online viewers, we encourage you also to ask questions. You can use the comment section to write any questions. And again, we'll take some time at the second part of today's event to be able to respond to that. And for the in-person audience who's lucky enough to be here in person, we'll have snacks and refreshments upstairs because Michael very generously offered to open up his studio so we have the chance to see his materials that he's working with in the studio. He's only been here for a week, so it's very much a work in progress, but definitely a real treat to be able to see that. And just certainly, as we're getting started, we really want to begin by saying what a privilege it is to be able to gather together with you all tonight. Certainly now more than ever during this difficult time of global conflict, we're really grateful for the extreme privilege it is to be able to gather together, to share and discuss art and culture. So we really appreciate having you all with us today, both in person and the folks who are joining us online. So a few notes to share with you about today's speaker. Michael Brennan is an American painter who's based in Brooklyn, New York. He has exhibited his paintings and works on paper nationally and internationally for several decades, including having shows in the US, Mexico, Belgium, France, Germany, here in Italy, China, Australia, and New Zealand. His works have been reviewed in publications, including the New York Times, Art in America, Art News, Art New England, the Brooklyn Rail, ArtNet Magazine, New York Arts, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. His work is included in collections such as the Baltimore Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the San Jose Museum of Art, American Express, General Dynamics, and so many corporations named some. He currently has a solo exhibition, Floating Weeds, which is on view through December 6th at Minus Space in Brooklyn. So for our online viewers, if you happen to be in the New York area through December 16th, we highly recommend going to see this show that's up. The show actually opened on October 7th, and right after Michael and his wife hopped on a plane to be able to fly right over here. So we really appreciate having both of them here with us for this month as part of our Siena Art Institute community in this very tumultuous time. So in addition to his work as a visual artist, Michael is also an accomplished arts writer. And his reviews and essays have been published in the Brooklyn Rail, ArtNet Magazine, Two Coats of Paint, The Village Voice, the Architect's Newspaper, American Abstract Artists, the Smithsonian Institution's Archive of American Art, as well as numerous catalogs. In terms of his educational background, Michael earned his MFA in painting and his MS in art history from Pratt Institute after earning a BA in classics from the University of Florida. He's taught at Pratt Institute since 1998 and is currently an adjunct professor in Pratt's Fine Arts Department. Prior to his teaching at Pratt, he has also taught in other institutions in New York City, including the School of Visual Arts, Hunter College, and Cooper. So again, for those of our viewers who are joining us online, we very much welcome you to have any questions to share in the comment section, and we'll take some time at the second part of today's talk to be able to respond to a Q&A, and of course also from our fantastic in-person audience. So without further ado, I turn the stage over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I want to thank everyone. Everyone here has been so welcoming, and I've only been here a week, but I feel like I've been here a month because of the quietude of the place, and it's been really wonderful in so many unexpected ways already. And I can kind of feel it working on me already. So it's this is the first time I've done a residency, and it's been really interesting, and kind of obviously an oasis too with everything that's going on in the world right now. This has been kind of a wonderful year, a strange year. Most of the work that I'm going to show you that's in the exhibition that's up right now was created during the isolation period of COVID. So to kind of still be in that at the end of it and to have an exhibition and to do a residency and to be traveling again, I feel very, very fortunate. You know, like one of the unexpected things I was telling Lisa about this, we did a tech check yesterday to make sure everything was working. And I went back to the artist studios and I opened the door and there was a snake inside the door. And I thought it was small, it was like a thin one, but still, like biologically, I see a snake. And this doesn't happen every day. And I opened the door, he was really agitated, he was kind of stuck in the corner. On his way out, and all was well. So I had to look it up. It's supposed to be an omen of spiritual growth and wisdom. So the magic continues. So this first slide is just a shot of the 9 paintings that are in my exhibition, Floating Weeds at Midas Space in Brooklyn. I'm going to show some of these just by way of introduction. And I'm not going to show like every painting I've ever made, but I do want to go kind of into the background of how I kind of arrived at this work over actually a pretty long period. This gallery, Midas Space, specializes in showing reductive and minimal art. It's in its, I think, 23rd year, if I'm not mistaken. And I've been with them since the beginning, although in the beginning it began as a website. Matthew Delegate and Rosanna Martinez, which was interesting because they set up the context for the gallery before an actual space, which is more commonplace now, but then it was unusual. And this is the 4th or 5th physical space that they've had, and I'm happy to have shown it a few times. It's actually an old stable in the center of Dumbo, which is an acronym for Down Under Manhattan Bridge, underneath Manhattan Bridge. Very scenic part of New York that you might have seen in the movie like Once Upon a Time in America. Anyway, it's an old stable, and for this show, I deliberately kind of underhung it, and I kept the back wall blank because of how the space is channeled. Usually that's where people put their masterpiece, their big, large painting, and I kind of wanted to go against that kind of thinking. And so on this wall, I have 5 paintings, and obviously I'm working in a reductive way, and there's probably more in common from painting and painting than different, but actually the format of each of these paintings is different, as is the color and the marking. And so I kind of wanted this wall to highlight what the art historian Heinrich Wolfland once called open enclosed form. And then on the other wall, actually this is a shot from the end, looking out into Dumbo of the 5 paintings. This was the first painting in the lead, just to kind of give you a feeling. And I have a lot of these off-angle shots so that you can get a feeling for the painting as an object as well. I repeat formats a lot, but I never repeat images. So if I go back to the beginning, I mean, I've been painting for 40 years now, and just to give you some background, I grew up in Florida, and I was kind of an arty kid. I took like the kind of classes that you have here. I took painting and drawing classes, and then when I was in junior high, high school, I took a lot of drafting and what was then called the industrial arts, which really kind of shaped my worldview, even though I never followed up on that in any kind of practical way. I would say growing up in Florida in the 60s and 70s, in terms of art, it was very kind of isolated. There were museums in the town that I grew up in, but if they did show art, it was usually like Tiffany lamps, that kind of thing. So I didn't have exposure to like a wide range of painting or other kinds of art or from different cultures. When I was in college at the University of Florida, I was taking an art history class, and there was an exhibition called Post-War Painting from Brandeis University. It was mostly highlights from the New York school that was at the University of Florida. So that was my first opportunity to see like de Kooning, Pollock, Mangold, all these artists that were associated with that school. And I saw this one painting, not this one in particular, by James Brooks, who was an original abstract expressionist. He was a roommate of Jackson Pollock's on St. Mark's Place for some time. He was a little bit behind the other artists in that movement because he actually served in World War II for 5 years. He wasn't on the WPA, he didn't have that kind of community exposure prior. But he made some important contributions, one of which was he was one of the first to paint both sides of the canvas that the paint soaked through, the soak stain method, which is often credited to the painter Helen Frankenthaler about 10 years later, but Brooks was doing it in the 40s. I saw a painting a bit like this. The painting I saw was called Rodado, and it had these large kind of lumbering forms. The only visual analog I could make at the time was a bit like standing in a forest. And I had kind of a typical kind of hostile reaction to the art that I was seeing because it's all new to me. I didn't have any context, but it intrigued me enough that I kind of kept going back. And it was sort of the mystery of this painting that I couldn't really figure out exactly what it was. That began my interest specifically in abstract painting. So I was taking a lot of art history, as I said, and at that time, I don't think this is the case anymore, I was taught that modernism was formed kind of as a synthesis between neoclassicism and romanticism in the early 19th century, of which this Goya print, The Sleep of Reason Leads to Nightmares. That was sort of my understanding of the foundation of modernism. And I found that these kinds of forms actually come up. This is one of the paintings in my show. Yeah, I'm not saying this is a painting of bats at all, but there's something about that intersection between romanticism and neoclassicism that still interests me, even in a very much postmodern kind of way. When I got to New York, because once I became interested in painting, my professors were like, well, you have to go to New York, which was true at the time because that's where the conversation happens. You can meet artists, people debate art. People debate art in New York the way that they debate college football in Florida. It's just a different kind of thing. And not long after arriving in New York City in 1988, there was a small exhibition of Christopher Wilmarth, who was a student of Tony Smith's, at the Museum of Modern Art. And I saw this piece in particular, New Night. It's really this one sheet of bronze that's bent, one sheet of glass, and a piece of Roebling cable, like from the Brooklyn Bridge. And then the glass is painted with hydrochloric acid, which gives it this frosted look. So it's very symbolic and romantic and a bit haunted, I guess, for lack of a better term. I mean, it's just these base materials, glass, and bronze, but standing in front of this, it had an incredible presence to it. It was, in my mind, something larger than the materials themselves. And that really hit me pretty hard because I didn't know that you could do something like that. So few items. But he knew his materials very well. And he sort of achieved that. Here's another view where you can see the acid etched surface just a little bit more. And it's not so much the minimalism of the piece that intrigues me, the fact that it's actually kind of inhabited. Like there's something there that really interests me. Despite, I mean, scientifically, I know it's vacant. Here's a piece from about the same time by the minimalist Donald Judd. It's almost lampooning this idea. It's totally anti-romantic. It's a black tarry field of wood, and then he's embedded this baking pan. So the baking pan becomes this like receptacle for whatever your thoughts may or may not be. But Even kind of in the Lampoon version, kind of mocking it. I feel like this one's inhabited too with this attitude and spirit. But I'm principally a painter, and one of the painters that I like quite a bit. It's kind of uncategorical. It's Edwin Dickinson. He's sometimes categorized as an American surrealist, but there's really a whole lot more going on with his work. And at the time, the art world that he inhabited in the early 19th century in the United States was defined by these city exhibitions, like the Illinois Biennial, and artists would submit work, and the idea was to win prizes and to sell work, and that was really the kind of the art world before galleries at that time. So he had two strands in his work. He had paintings that he would labor on for years that were intentional kind of masterpieces that he would make for these situations. Philip Guston would do this too. But then he would have these other paintings that he called premier coup, first strike in French, where he would just try to do them in one session. And actually, if you think back to the James Brooks painting that I started with, some of the forms here in the ultramarine and gray are very similar to this kind of lumbering kind of form. Obviously, there's a woman's face, it's highly detailed. But I find these premier coup works that he would just do kind of in one session. They really kind of stretch the possibilities of representation, but also paint itself as representation, which interests me. Another artist that I discovered in New York that I didn't know prior was Myron Stout, who's kind of a proto-minimalist. This is a very velvety charcoal work on paper. And it might seem overly simplistic for a lot of people's taste. I mean, it's so reductive, but if you spend more time with his work, these forms start to move, and there's a little bit of chaos in there, not unlike Mondrian. And for me, there's a big difference between people who are just using geometry as a style and people who are really kind of investigating and pushing that aesthetic. And Myron Stout is one of them. And he has this quality that I like quite a bit, where the work is both geometric and atmospheric at the same time. That's a combination that I quite respond to. And here's another master of it, getting a little bit more toward the supernatural. This is the 19th century engraver, English engraver, John Martin, who was a contemporary of John Milton and did illustrations for Paradise Lost with mezzotint, which is the printmaking process that gives you kind of the blackest blacks. And he's such a master of contrast of value, and which is basically the arty way of saying controlling his lights and darks. And he gets these ethereal effects. His paintings are interesting too. They're extremely apocalyptic, and I think he's kind of forgotten about as an artist now. But the apocalyptic paintings often end up on heavy metal album covers, that sort of thing. This is a shot of Halloween in New York with a Polaroid SX70, which was an instant photograph type camera that was very popular in the 70s. I think the framing and the formatting, the way of fixing an image of photography influenced my work too. I studied photography in high school, maintained something of a photography practice. I think it just kind of shapes the way that I read images, which accounts maybe for one aspect of how my work is framed. And about this time, maybe 10 years ago, I got really interested in this subgenre of photography called spirit photography. Now, I've shown some spooky things, but I'm not really interested in ghosts, like phantasma. I'm not really interested in them. What I'm really interested in is how artists visualize something that's imaginary or unseen. And one thing that is interesting about ghosts is that they manifest themselves differently in different cultures. So this would be, this kind of vapor ghost would be more the Anglo-Irish ghost, kind of blue-green, smells like honey baked ham. In other cultures, it's like a whole different kind of criteria. And this was a very healthy genre of photography. Here's a man levitating at a seance. There was a huge exhibition of these at the And these are some of my favorite, where the ectoplasm of the spirit is exiting the person who's possessed. It's often some kind of cotton or lace. This is at the beginning of photography, and people were who weren't familiar with the technology were fooled, just like we might be fooled by some kind of AI depiction today. But some of them are very imaginative, and I like the proportions of how they use the dark in relationship to, say, the phantasm of the lace. This is Mike Kelly, the Los Angeles conceptual artist. He did a whole send-up of these himself quite successfully. And even in abstract expressionism, this is a painting by Bradley Walker Tomlin, who was a bit more of a fringe figure in the movement. But he did these paintings in black and white that are kind of moving away from the stenographic kind of forms of Miro or other painters at the time, and into something that is almost trying to become the articulation of something supernatural. And the title, Attention by Moonlight, kind of gives that away. I'm interested in these things because it's a way of generating new form. I think inspiration can come from a lot of things. I mean, I like these for different reasons too, like the psychology, like the anxiety on this woman's face is so much more impressive than, say, the ghost itself. Or the proportion of this baby's floating head against this hazy field. Or this one's probably the most famous. It's like bar of energy that's kind of happening, and this stunned witness is kind of turning her head to kind of share in the experience of the viewer. And this was a painting that I made maybe for my second or third exhibition at Minus Space, maybe 10 years ago, and I called it Vampire. And it was made with a charcoal ground, and it was using a knife to kind of, I don't know, convey a suggestion of something. And the bar at the bottom was meant to be geometric and to reinforce the presence of it as an object, but maybe to have another kind of energy, a second infinite, another kind of space. Here's sort of the side view. Another one. You can see some variation in the surface. The charcoal is a large particle, so the knife would make it shift, so we get like a nice surface variation. So I'm also interested in film, and especially early film, like early photography, early film, primitive film too. And of course, with film, there's this theory of montage from Sergei Eisenstein, that since film is about sort of splicing together different images, that you have your first image, and then you have your second image that you cut to, and then it forms a third image in the mind of the viewer. And that's sort of the power of cinema. And that's something that intrigues me. Here's an image where, like, obviously an animal form, an owl, and a man kind of in filmic transition. This actually might be from Eisenstein, I don't remember. And here's a painting I did also from about 10 years ago. This is probably as figurative as I'll ever get. It's basically knife markings. Think of, attack like Lucio Fontana or something. But there was some kind of presence, maybe, some kind of visage. I've moved away from this a bit, but that's sort of where the work that I'm doing now came out of. Here's a side view. This is a painting I did just a week ago upstairs. It has that doubling, and I think of that as cinematic form. I work for an artist, Doug Olson, and there's a lot of symmetry in modern art, especially in geometric art. He would often talk, I don't have an image of it, unfortunately, of this painting by Jackson Pollock, this very Jungian portrait called Portrait in a Dream. You have kind of one area of action and then another area of action that's slightly different. And that would create kind of an asymmetrical rhythm within a symmetrical format. And that's something that I think about a lot in terms of that film form. Maybe two different images, similar but different, kind of coming together to form a new narrative. Here's a bit of a closer look. This is a still card from David Lynch, The Elephant Man. And I mean, without seeing the film, I mean, you can piece together some of the narrative, a hostile crowd, this, poor man who is disfigured with this disease, just with a few sequences. And this is another image from my studio, one of the paintings I showed at the beginning. This is called Scrape to See. This is something I'm trying to get maybe with landscape. Since 2018, I've had the privilege of teaching in Venice during the summer with Pratt Venice. It's been wonderful. It's exposed me to so much. It's really kind of changed me as a person because of the entire history of painterly oil painting sort of begins there with Titian. That's a whole other lecture in the use of canvas. It's changed the chemistry of my work. I'm working with lapis lazuli as a result. I'm adding glass to my paints. I'm using a more lubricious medium. And all this comes from several summers of meditating on Venetian painting. But the thing that I probably responded to the most, and who wouldn't, is the lagoon, the actual physicality of the space. And when we're there in the summer, I think I shot this at 10 o'clock at night. I mean, it's kind of like, you probably have all been there, you know this. There's this kind of endless twilight that happens, and all these wonderful effects that happen between the water and the sky, and people like Turner and Monet, non-Italian painters have responded to it over time. This was my assistant, Koshke, he's my friend. We would just wander around and take in this kind of light. And I feel like I would go there almost as a reporter because I'm not working while I'm there because I'm there for the students. But I'm trying to absorb so much of Venice as I can to hopefully bring back with me to Brooklyn, which I'll get to in a minute. So obviously, gondola. And then something like this really intrigues me. This is a woodcut by Titian, and it's Pharaoh's army being drowned by the Red Sea. But it doesn't look like the Red Sea in the Middle East. It looks a lot like Venice. And so the use of the landscape to tell another kind of story, and sort of the interpretation of water through a stiff medium like woodcut, all these kinds of exchanges really interest me. I know I'm kind of all over the board here. Like this guy's talking about this and he's talking about that, but I'm basically rummaging through my mind and hopefully I'm communicating like 10% of what went into my work. So I live in Brooklyn. I live in Gowanus, which is the industrial part of Brooklyn, which is often called the Venice of Brooklyn, which is really funny because it has canals, but it's not like Venice at all. And it never will be, but I like it quite a bit. And, I was having this wonderful thing that was happening in Venice. And then, of course, there was a global pandemic, and the program got shut down for 2 years. And we're just kind of supposed to stay close to home and not engage with people. So I spent a lot of time wandering around in the industrial part of my neighborhood, which oddly reminded me quite a bit of Florida, where I grew up, because in this one part, it's so flat, it makes sense that the Dutch loved it there. That you would get this kind of big sky. And I started thinking, oh, what can I do with this? What can I do with what I have? And I think I would walk around here. I haven't thought about this in a while. I'd walk around these empty sites and pretend I was in Venice, like that area up there. I would pretend that was an Altana, like the Doge lives up there or something. But it's not. It was pure imagination. And because of the isolation, this like little island named Dyke's Lumber became like a friend. And this is one of the first paintings that I made, trying to bring that environment back into my studio. Something of Venice, something of Gowanus. I made this painting with a knife, and I was using lapis lazuli, which until anarchy basically broke out in Afghanistan as a result of the American exit. You can't get this anymore. It all comes. All lapis lazuli comes from either Afghanistan or Chile. The kind from Afghanistan is the kind that you see in the Pinacoteca here. It's the superior kind. That's all kind of dried up for now. But this kind of became the prototype for the work that I would do now. And I feel like it was kind of a symbiotic relationship between my environment, what was happening right outside my door, and what was happening inside my door. So there's one of the photographs I took, and there's one of the paintings that was as a result. And this is the beginning of the work in the show. Funny things started to happen too, because I was in a pandemic state of mind. I posted this one and I told people it was an octopus. And there was this great outcry, like, how could somebody do that to an octopus? But it's really just a piece of cardboard. And I got me interested in surrealist photography. This is the abattoir photographs of Elie Lothar, where what you're looking at is not necessarily what you think you're looking at. And they have kind of a painterly quality. That's a bit of a digression. Of all the images I took, this one of the Gowanus Canal is probably the closest to maybe passing as Venetian, but no, I mean, it can't. Forgot why I included this, but this was work from the time made with lapis. You know, I'm stuck inside my studio. I'm teaching classes online. I'm reading about surfers and looking at pictures from the 70s of Jerry Lopez, championship surfers surfing. I'm thinking about water and sky and what can I do with this? And I'm trying to find this connection with my hand and the material with the knife. This is one of the paintings. This is a studio shot that's included in the show. So I made this one in 2021, which was a really difficult year for me. More so than 2020. 2020, we all kind of powered through it. 2021, it was like, this is never going to end. Since I was thinking about skies and water, I wanted to look at how other artists interpreted that. And it's kind of funny, this Delacroix sky is a similar format. That definitely influenced me and kind of dovetailed with my Polaroid kind of framing instinct. I started collecting these and sharing them online. Of course, Turner is a master of this and can do so much with so little. So ahead of his time. I mean, there's barely anything here, and there's a ship and a scene, three seascapes on one piece of paper. Here he's copying the work of Claude Lorrain, so it's art imitating art, not nature. And then this is a constable who's also very wonderful at painting clouds, but his hand with watercolor, just like the painting, is a bit heavy. I'm not thinking it's worse, it's just different. Here's a constable painting. Great weather effect. This kind of turbulence is something that interests me, and I can never be a true minimalist, partly because I come from Florida. And I was growing up in Florida at the time because of the climate, like, this will be a situation that's the opposite of what you have here. Like, it probably hasn't rained here in a month or so. When I was growing up in Florida, it would rain 3-4 times a day. Like, the sky would turn black, the John Martin apocalypse, rain, and then it would dry up like an hour later, and then it would rain again, and it was like this. So this kind of work, aside from its romanticism, the atmospherics for me is another mode of expression. I just want to show one more from this group because he's underknown. This is the work of Luke Howard. Is anyone familiar with Luke Howard? He was an amateur meteorologist. He had some industry job that he did, but he was English, and in his free time, he studied clouds at the beginning of the 19th century. And he's the one who gave us the nomenclature, the Latin nomenclature, cumulus, strato, cumulus, nimbus, all this. He's the namer of the clouds. And his system stuck because his genius was he had terms for clouds that were in transition. Anyway, he did in his journal many watercolor studies. I find these even more intriguing because he's not trying to make anything necessarily pleasing as an artist. He's approaching it more as a scientist, trying to document phenomena. And the whole idea is really absurd. This is why I love it. I mean, the idea that you could take just a little bit of aquacolor, just a little bit of turquoise, and somehow with a small white piece of paper, you could capture the filtered light of the entire atmosphere. But they get so close. And I think just kind of rubbing up to the edge of it, just getting close to it, for me, this is a great power in art. There's next to nothing here, and yet there's miles of space. And he's not as skilled as Turner or Constable because he wasn't trained as an artist. But in terms of his receptivity, his openness to the phenomenon, I find them just incredible. This appeals to the minimalist in me, just a little bit of information going such a long way. I mean, this one stinks because it's got the Chiron from Getty Images, but I couldn't find the image anywhere else, and I had to have it. I mean, there's almost nothing there. It's like he just wiped it, and yet it has the suggestion of infinity, of light, and air, space. This was a work that I made probably about 8 years, around the same time. But this has been kind of a long-running issue with me. Like I'm trying to, I'm using this knife. What can I find in these marks? And if I scrape something, what's left, and what does that mean? Oops. And so I came here. For those of you that are going to join me for the open studio, and I hope you do, because you have another kind of conversation in the studio rather than when you have a lecture. Yeah, I came here, I packed all these paintings, I packed up my precious lapis lazuli. I was afraid it was going to get impounded by TSA, and I had all these plans, like, this is what I'm going to make. I had my show, I'm going to make this, I'm going to do this research. And I get here and it's like, I don't want to do that anymore. So I got some paper, and now I'm doing these watercolors. I don't know what's happening. I'm trying to do a Luke Howard thing. This thing has the presence of, like, you put a cup of coffee on a napkin, and there's like that little ring left behind. Like, I'm trying to do something with that that's going to blow people away. I know it's crazy. And I've only been at it for a week, but that's the power of a residency to kind of unleash something like that. So here's a painting that chose not to include in my show. I want to talk a little bit about how the show came together. Just a few more minutes, we'll be done. But this is sort of me at my most atmospheric. I'm knifing, I'm wiping, I'm adding paint, I'm subtracting paint. For me, with painting, all kinds of painting, figurative, adding and subtracting is a very important part of the document. I want to talk about 3 figures that have been very important to me. One is Arshil Gorky, who, since I began painting, has been just a very important figure for me. I've read all 6 of the biographies. If you're going to read one, the Hayden Herrera one is the best. And there's a really excellent movie online called Finding Gorky that goes into his life from his daughters. It's very much a 21st century story because he was an immigrant from Armenia, came to New York, kind of created himself as an artist, and made this work in a way that doesn't happen now. Like, he spent 10 years maybe painting just like Cézanne to learn it. He spent quite a bit of time painting like Miro, which you can kind of see here, but he's starting to exit it. This painting is probably unfinished. It was exhibited at Hauser and Wirth in New York last year. The atmospheric of it really intrigues me, and there's a lot of debate about his form too. The historian that did his catalog raisonné has decoded these forms. They all represent like barnyard animals, that kind of thing. There's a little bit more than that going on, but it's the way that he handles paint, so lyrical, and the atmospherics of it. He draws like the wind. Also, too, in art history, Gorky is still framed as a bridge figure, somebody who's coming out of surrealism, who's a bona fide surrealist. Breton recognized him, going into abstract expressionism, and something of a mentor to de Kooning. So he's seen as this bridge figure to something else. To my mind, he's an abstract expressionist that was going in a direction that the rest of them decided not to go into. So I feel like there's some ground here to cover. And as a painter, to find yourself, sometimes you have to find territory that you can explore. So you can see here, this painting I didn't include in the show. It's also from the group. It's painted with silver, and I'm scraping quite a bit to get sort of that penumbra, or to use an even fancier word, palimpsest of marks. Here's another Gorky. The other thing that I like about him is it's entirely abstract, but he's still coming from a pictorial reference. So he arranges things in space, so they have a coherence. I don't like, I love abstraction, but I don't love all abstraction. I don't like things that are entirely formless or are completely random, have no structure. And I'll say this very quickly too. A lot of people think, oh, abstraction can be anything, and that's true, it can be anything. But when it comes down to it in painting, there's only really a few strategies. There's gesture, there's geometry, there's not that much else. In fact, because you have to establish form somehow. You don't have a figure. How do you do that? So there's some real issues in terms of the limitations of abstraction. Here's one of my paintings. This one's called, this is in the show, it's called Black Mountain StARTers. So when I wasn't walking around Gowanus fantasizing that I was in Florida or the pandemic was over and everything was okay, I was in my studio, I was reading a lot about Black Mountain College, Experimental Art College in Asheville, North Carolina. A lot of the painters that I really admire either taught there or were students there. And I thought, well, if I had been there, what would I have done? You know, well, I would have done like just the coffee stain on the napkin. This is what I would have made. This is highly pixelated, but this is also a Gorky. You can see like that could be a parent on the far right. It still has, if it doesn't have figurative references per se, it still has some figurative structure, which I think is interesting. So I'm working almost exclusively with a palette knife. I add and subtract the paint, as I mentioned. I'm trying to make these marks that somehow have meaning. What is a meaningful mark? I'm not sure I can really answer that, but I have great faith in mark making as a human kind of endeavor, the way that other people feel probably about the figure. This is a Gorky drawing. This is another one, just this endless kind of invention of forms really interests me. And when I was reading about Black Mountain, I stumbled across this forgotten figure, Dan Rice. Dan Rice was a student at Black Mountain, then he taught at Black Mountain. He was the favorite painter of Franz Klein, who taught at Black Mountain, Mark Rothko, who visited, and de Kooning. He came back to New York and became a painter in his own right. He had several exhibitions at Poindexter Gallery in the 60s. He's totally obscure now. Black Mountain College Museum did a survey of his works on paper. I liked them so much. I was so moved. I bought the catalog. I found one of his daughters, and I bought this drawing from her. And I keep it in my studio to study. There's something about that field of charcoal and those lyrical marks. It's very Gorky-like in a sense. He was probably using a liner brush like Gorky of ink that are kind of dancing in the field. He's from a different time. He's at the end of abstract expressionism when pop and minimalism are taking over. And he's trying to find a more understated way to kind of go forward. So I found quite a bit. And I think he's a master marksman. He did a lot of covers for these books of poetry that were produced by Black Mountain College that included the great poets that formed the Black Mountain School. Those marks, the seemingly random marks, the way that they kind of assemble into a structure, this is something that I've really studied quite a bit. He is a master marksman. And that's something maybe I'm trying in this quest for a meaningful mark that I'm trying to find with my knife as I go back and forth, drawing into the paint, scraping, adding, this sort of thing. Here's another one, work on paper. His paintings look quite a bit like this. They can often be largely empty with this kind of intense moments, almost like a bite from a hair or something. And it has this drift to the right that I like quite a bit too. So I'm thinking about that asymmetry and maybe something like this where I'm knifing on the right. And I've got this almost like dragon-like silhouette that's coming out of the paint. That's not what it is. I mean, it's just paint. But I'm trying to find something in this one layer of paint between the pure white of the gesso underneath and, in this case, the ultramarine that's on top. And I feel like if I can articulate that somehow, I'm going to find something special. I don't know. I'm testing the limits of the material. Almost done. Bear with me. A few more figures. I like these outsider monochrome people too. Arnold Schoenberg, the composer, he did a lot of portraits and works on paper. And this is strangely called exhaling blue. A lot of people painted in orange monochrome. He's trying to do something more. There's something to this emanation that I like, getting back to the phantasm. There's another painter I really like, Italian painter, who painted a lot of red-orange monochromes, Piero Ruggiero. And I saw one of his paintings at Esso Gallery in New York about 15 years ago. And everybody had these really quiet, staid, very beautiful monochrome paintings. And his was like, it was like attacked with a knife. I mean, it was like, it was the monochrome equivalent of, say, who's the guy I'm thinking of who makes the Giallo films, like it's always like a knife and a black glove. Not Mario Bava, the guy after him, the bird with the crystal plumage. Dario Argento. He's like the Dario Argento of monochrome painting. I mean, this is incredibly violent, but I love its lyricism. He has a very particular energy. And then one of my other heroes, this is going way back, because this is what I thought painting was going to be about. This is Blinky Palermo in the 70s. This is in his New York studio. He was German. He was Joseph Beuys's favorite student at the Dusseldorf Academy. He comes to New York. I love it. This is blurry. It's a scanned Polaroid, but I love this guy. He's so cool with his white belt. And he's got his, those are his Coney Island paintings in the background. They're purely geometric. They're on an aluminum panel. You can see the aluminum panel stacked to the right. It's been hugely influential to me. These are the Coney Island paintings at Dia. Before he kind of figured out exactly what he was doing, there's something about the seriality. I'm definitely thinking about that when I'm presenting my work. My work is not geometric. The geometric people don't like me. I'm too expressionistic. I'm too atmospheric. But in a separate lecture, I would go into his work is known for its porosity. It's a closed system, but it's remarkably open and intuitive way compared to other practitioners of geometric abstraction. So these specialists all kind of interest me. This is one of my paintings, and here it's just color, not much atmosphere. I'm knifing it, and I'm barely scraping it, and I'm hoping, I didn't include these in the show, I'm still kind of sitting with it, that it conveys something. So I want to get into my studio practice a bit. So in the gallery, in the show, it's all presented so cleanly and so rationally. You have this wall, you have that wall. But in my studio, even though I'm clean, it's a mess. Like I move these things around. I try to see who talks to each other. I've got a yardstick there. I'm trying to figure out how far apart they should be. I stack them up like this game, Indian poker. It's or something like this. 1, 2, 3, and then I put the silver one on top. It's a way of me getting to know them. I like to keep them around for a while. If they're good, they reveal themselves differently over time. I do a lot of works on paper to test out the paint with the knife to see how viscous it is. Even in this, I try to see, can I capture something? I don't know, phase, the presence, something. I move them around. I tape them together like a rat king. I'm trying to figure out how they go together and what they could mean. This is my studio desk. So that when the time comes and I have to do something that's kind of cleaner or well-dressed, I can kind of do this. It takes a lot of sorting out. This painting seems to be a big hit. It's an outlier because I painted it in green. Probably going to keep me busy for the next couple of years. But I put them with other paintings to see how if they're talking to each other. What are they saying? What do the marks mean? I look at a lot of film. Ozu's been very important to me. This is one of his notebooks where he's masking out shots. I feel like the formatting speaks to me. They're very formal. This is an interesting film. If you only watch one Ozu film, it's called Floating Weeds. I named the show after it. He made it early. This is from the 50s. He made it in the 30s as a silent film. And originally, it was cribbed from a Hollywood screenplay. So it exists as a Hollywood film in the 20s, a Japanese film in the 30s before the war, and a Japanese film in the 50s afterwards, and one of his first films in color. This kind of blocking and formatting is something that I think about in order to heighten the image. So I study these films. This is from Kurosawa, Seven Samurai. The black and white films, they scan vertically as well as horizontally. Think about the forms on the left, say. There's the archer on the left, or when you're trying to mask these marks so that they have meaning. One of the things you look for in art is something called occult balance, which means kind of like a sense of rightness where things are, whether it's a Morandi still life or a jumble of marks like this. The left, the right, the scraping. I look at them from different angles like you would in life. That's it.
Fabulous. Wow, there's so much food for thought. It's yeah, just such a wonderful array of your references as well as the glimpse into your process as well. We've got some really nice notes just shared online. There's one question that came in from one of our faculty members, Jeff Shapiro, who was just saying at the start of your talk, you had mentioned Jackson Pollock. And Jeff asks, I believe he suffered tremendous stress when first looking to create something new. Do you think the quest for newness still counts as a pressure for artists?
You know, with modernism, there was probably an overemphasis on newness and originality. It's still a condition, even, you know, within like the figurative painting that's happening now. There's this dictum from Alex Katz. It's got to be new. It's got to be terrific. It's really hard to figure out what that is. And I think as much as I agree that Pollock did suffer from that, it got even worse after he hit the heights of, say, the classic drip paintings and then the Jungian black and white paintings. The last 5 years of his life, I think he only made 4 or 5 paintings before he died in a car accident. And some of them are very interesting, like Easter in the Totem or Scent, all of which are in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. They all point in different directions. I think Krasner actually worked out of Eastern Totem quite a bit. There's been no follow-up to Scent, let's say, but I think that was a crushing burden for him. He couldn't find a new plateau. So I think it is a burden. I think we're all trying to articulate, I hope, some kind of personal voice. And like Miles Davis said, it takes a long time to play like yourself. It takes a long time to sort through these things and find. I think in my experience working with students, I think in the beginning, a lot of times when people first step into painting, like I did, you're maybe 80% your influences and 20% yourself. And hopefully as you develop and grow old with it, hopefully that becomes inverted. You're always going to carry some influence. I mean, I pretty much gave a roadmap to all of mine.
Were there questions from our in-person audience? Obviously, we'll also have the chance to chat more over snacks for our lucky in-person crew. But while we're still together with our online folks, yeah.
I'd like to know something about you spoke about the lapis.
Yes.
So at the moment I'm going to sleep, I'm working with the stones, precious stones. I'd just like to know how you prepare this lapis, if you powder.
I have purveyors who have already prepared it in dispersion and oil, but even within that commercial part of it, there's a really broad range. Like I don't want to get sued or anything, but I think like the kind that some companies get is the Chilean kind, which doesn't have the same richness as the Afghanistan. There have been quite a few purveyors that I've worked with in England, Michael Harding, and especially Wallace and Seymour, who have many different grades of lapis. And they very cleverly market them like, this is the Titian lapis, this is the Mantegna lapis. They're basically different grades of blue, but they even sell, which I find interesting, the ultramarine ash, which is the gray byproduct. And some of the gray paintings that I painted were made with the ash. What I like about it is not so much the blue itself. The newer blues, ultramarine blue, some of the other blues, they're much stronger in their blueness. It's the mineral quality and how it dries, and that's what I like. And it's a very expensive habit to make great paints. So the learning about in powdered glass, which I picked up from the Venetian tradition. That way I can get that kind of consistency with not necessarily having to have a precious stone. But there's probably a lot of overlap in our interests because one of the things with Venice too, we learned about the vendicolori and the whole trade basically of lapis and other things like malachite or green. I've been experimenting with celadonite lately. So it's all kind of fascinating. And those materials like gold, lapis, it might be historical or cultural, but they do have an aura that even in this era, they retain. And there's I don't want to get too mystical, but there is kind of an intersection in painting or any art practice. It does cross over a bit with alchemy. There's a really interesting book that my students often read called What Painting Is. It kind of goes into the material qualities of painting, some of which I think is lost because so many people just use acrylic or things that they can buy off the shelf. The thing that's really interesting about oil paint is that anything that can be ground up and put in oil can be oil paint. So the range is incredibly broad. At one point, they were even grinding up mummies and making mummy color. So I find this a very fascinating part of the whole practice. I'm really into the materials, and when I'm with other painters like my colleagues at Pratt, I could talk about. Masking tape for like hours. It's part of the fun. Like the way maybe golfers talk about different golf clubs. And a lot of times you get your best tips talking with people who have more experience working with other materials than you do, and they tell you what not to do. And that's one of the things I really like about it, is sharing that kind of information.
I'm so glad you brought up the lapis lazuli, because that's also something we've been discussing with our students in our Art and Society course. We read an excerpt from Rebecca Solnit's Field Guide to Getting Lost, where she talks about, in the Blue of the Distance chapter, the role of lapis lazuli in creating atmospheric perspective, but also the identity of the material, but the notion of creating distance through the use of blue is quite fascinating.
And the whole intersection between materiality and spirituality kind of interests me. They're really at cross purposes, because if you're going towards spirituality, it's like a non-material thing. But I think artists, certainly in the use of lapis, the history of lapis, that's something that they were trying to get to, whether it was the veil of a Madonna, say in the Pinacoteca, or there's this idea that the materials are special, the whole thing is more special somehow, maybe. There's a really great book on blue by William Gass called On Being Blue that's in PDF format online. I highly recommend that to anybody, even just the first paragraph who's interested in blue.
Well, maybe we can perhaps continue the conversation over some refreshments with our in-person crew. I'll just mention to our online viewers that next week's presentation, so this same time next week, will not be live streamed. It'll just be an in-person presentation with the musicologist Guido Borchi. It'll be a presentation in Italian, but because of copyright issues, we won't be live streaming that event. But we definitely hope you can all come back for that. But thank you so much, Michael, for sharing this presentation with us, and we will continue in the open studio upstairs.